Hello and welcome to Podcast IDE, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so you should check out Linode. With private networking, shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale. Go to podcastinit.com/Linode to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. For complete visibility into your application stack, deployment tracking, and powerful alerting, Datadog has got you covered. With their monitoring, metrics, and log collection agent, including extensive integrations and distributed tracing, you'll have everything you need to find and fix bugs in no time. Go to podcastinit.com/Datadog today to start your free 14-day trial and get a sweet new t-shirt. And to get worry-free releases, download GoCD, the open-source continuous delivery server built by ThoughtWorks. You can use their pipeline modeling and value stream map to build, control, and monitor every step from commit to deployment in one place. Go to podcastinit.com/GoCD to learn more about their professional support services and enterprise add-ons. And visit podcastinit.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, and read the show notes. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Aivar Annamaa about Thonny, a Python IDE for beginning programmers. So, Aivar, could you start by introducing yourself?
Hi. As you said, my name is Aivar. I am a teaching assistant in University of Tartu, Estonia. I have a wife, 2 kids, and I have Thonny. So this is pretty much my life at the moment.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yes, I think I get it correct that 10 years ago I entered a computer science PhD program in my university. And as a PhD student, I was supposed to do some teaching. So I chose to teach the labs in our first programming course, which used and still uses Python. So basically, my first serious work with Python was as a Python teacher.
And as we mentioned at the open, one of the projects that you're heavily involved with is Thonny, which is an IDE that focuses on making it easier for beginning programmers to have a working development environment. So I'm wondering if you can talk about your motivation for building that project.
All right. So initially, I had a much more narrow goal. When I was teaching recursion in my labs, I noticed that too many students struggled because they had in their heads an oversimplified model about function calls. They seem to think that the function call, it means simply a jump from the call side to the definition side, and then somehow magically back again. And in some simple cases, this model kind of works. But when you add arguments, local variables, return values, and recursion, then it becomes really messy. So my solution was to explicitly talk about the concept of the stack frame, and used to draw it on the blackboard several times. And when I got fed up with this, then I realized I need a tool which makes this visualization for me. So this was the beginning of the Thonny, actually. So it was not planned as a full-featured IDE, actually.
And you mentioned one of the features is that visualization of the recursion stack and how the function actually ends up calling itself so that users can get a better visual understanding of what's actually happening. And I'm wondering if you can list some of the other features that you have added in over time that make it easier for users to understand what's happening in the context of their programs.
Well, the most important features are everything, as you said, everything which uncovers what happens during the program runtime. So, in other words, everything related to stepping through the program. Well, most IDEs can step through the program, but I believe Thonny has managed to make it more approachable and more meaningful for beginners. First, Thonny doesn't require the user to set up any breakpoints. The user doesn't need to know about breakpoints at all. You just run the program with a special command, and then start pressing certain key until you reach the end of the program. That's it. That's, in my opinion, enough for total beginners. Okay, if the programs get larger, this stepping with small step or stepping through the whole program becomes really tedious. And because of this, I plan to add proper breakpoints as an optional feature in the future. So it's easier to get started with stepping with Thonny. Second, I think it's important that Thonny's debugger, it follows program's logical structure, not just code lines as traditional debuggers. So, for example, you can step over a whole while statement, or on the other hand, step into the smallest sub-expression in your program. So the granularity of the stepping is dependent on the program structure, not on the textual format of the code. And I think this offers more flexibility, but maybe even more importantly, this provides good opportunity or good support for explaining Python's syntax or the statistical structure of the program. When you see how the debugger focuses one or the other part of the code. And as we also already mentioned, the visualization of the call frames, I think this is the feature I'm most proud of in Thonny. Besides this, if you leave the program flow aside, then I would also bring out this special mode for explaining Python memory model. If you select from the view menu the item called heap, then you see that the variable table only maps variable names to addresses, and the values or objects themselves are living elsewhere. So Thonny shows you another table called heap, which maps addresses to the actual values. So I think this is quite useful feature for explaining mutation and references. Yeah, I think these are the most important features in Thonny.
And it sounds like there are a number of very sort of advanced aspects of the program that you've built in order to present some of these concepts in a much simpler manner for your users. So I'm wondering what you found to be the most challenging pieces of actually building Thonny to create that simpler view for people who are just beginning to get started and not overwhelm them with too much information.
Fortunately, Python has been really forthcoming because of its dynamic nature, and because, for example, it has a Python parser in the standard library, and it has this wonderful inspect module which allows me to check the state of current stack frames. So I think the most complex questions were solved several years ago, so I have forgotten most of it. Yeah, I think maybe I start by explaining how Thonny works. So it works in two operating system processes. One for the GUI and the backend process for running the user program and the tracing or debugging mechanism. The GUI is written in TK Inter, and although many people think this framework is old-fashioned and looks ugly, then actually the newer versions of it look quite pretty, and I've grown to like it a lot. And the backend, the most important idea in implementing the debugger is that I don't give Python virtual machine the original user program. So in order to gain more information about the process of running the code, I modify the program before running it. So basically, Thonny parses user code and then inserts special function calls to it, special markers. And these calls let debugger know, for example, which sub-expression is going to be executed next and what was the value and the address of the last expression value, etc. So Thonny's debugger uses instrumented code. This was the key. This choice brings along an unfortunate aspect that the debugger is quite inefficient. So if you run a larger program and want to step over a large part of the code, then it happens quite slowly. But as Thonny is clearly designed and meant for beginners, for this reason I can assume that the programs are not too big, so it's not a too big problem at the moment.
And as users are first getting introduced to programming and the Python language, I'm wondering if there are any particular kinds of tutorials or supporting material that you've found to be the most useful for getting students up to speed on the principles that they need to be able to actually start writing programs and using Thonny to iterate through them.
In the similar fashion that I didn't find a good tool for explaining or for visualizing the stack frames and the code stack, I wasn't happy with the Estonian language materials meant for teaching Python for beginners. So actually I wrote my own textbook, a web-based textbook. And I think this is the material I am most happy with regarding programmers. And I'm not sure I can outline what have been my principles in writing this textbook. I think I managed to strike good balance on precision and avoiding unnecessary formalities. So that was what I was aiming in Thonny as well, to make the interface or the visualizations intuitive, but at the same time not oversimplified.
And in terms of the programming environment that Thonny presents, I actually installed it and experimented with it a little bit on a program that I was trying to debug, and I was pleased by the lack of visual clutter in the overall environment, which can be something that plagues some of the more advanced IDEs. So I'm wondering what types of design decisions you were faced with and what you were aiming for as you were building the UI for users to ensure that there weren't too many options that would confuse or overwhelm the users as they were first getting started.
User interface design has been interesting for me for a long time, and I always aimed for user interfaces which are as clear as possible. So in this sense, the work with Thonny was not special for me. I guess couple of times I have considered adding a toolbar over the REPL or the shell pane in addition to the main toolbar, but I have just resisted this urge and chose the clear look of the shell pane. Yeah, I guess you just need to give up some of your wishes when you want to maintain this clear appearance or find another way. I have used menus quite a lot, so I think menus are something that because they are hidden initially, then they are not intimidating for the beginner user.
Yeah, I think that gives a lot of sort of progressive exposure where the user can first just open up the program and start writing something.
Yeah.
And as they find that they need some additional functionality, they can then go searching through the menus to find it and then enhance their overall capabilities with the tool.
Mm-hmm. And that was also the reason why I chose not to show the variables panel by default. So I expect that when the student goes to her first lesson, then she starts with just running a program, and then the instructor tells, now students, select the view menu and open up the variables pane. So it makes the process more gradual.
And in terms of autocompletion, have you found that to be a useful feature as people are first getting started, or do you think that it adds too much confusion when somebody might start typing a variable name or a library function and have it give them that list of options?
At the moment, Thonny does support autocompletion, but only the user need to explicitly invoke it with the control spacebar or with the tab. And I think I will keep it. I will keep this as default because yes, I think it might be confusing for total beginners if something just pops up.
And as the users become more proficient in using Python and programming logic and start building more complicated applications, is there a point where it no longer makes sense to continue using Thonny, or does it grow with their experience so that they can use it once they start using it in a more professional context?
Yeah, I think this point will arrive because I have no intentions to compete with PyCharm or other professional Python IDEs in terms of, let's say, program refactorings or the level of program analysis. So I need to maintain the scope, and I think when a student has learned the semantics of required programming concepts, and when the programs grow bigger and he or she will benefit more from the good autocompletion and comfortable refactorings, then or she is really wise to abandon Thonny and use something heavier instead.
In terms of introducing people to the concepts of programming in general, how have you found Python for being the first language, and have you worked with any other languages for the introductory material to have any sort of comparison?
I think Python is a pretty good language, pretty good first language. Myself, I was using Pascal as a first language when I was learning programming. Sometimes I do regret that Python doesn't have static types as they were in Pascal, because occasionally I see that the dynamic typing of Python allows students to, or I don't know whether it allows or invites students to be less precise in their thinking. Something that static languages really punish quickly. If you don't understand what will be in your variable, then you will write the wrong type and annotation. In Python, I quite often see that the student even gets the program working correctly, but when I ask him what kind of values can be in this particular variable, he's unable to answer this question. And I think this is the place where static languages have an advantage. But on the other hand, Python, of course, has the advantage of enabling people to do complex stuff faster than many other languages. So it's not a clear answer whether it's a perfect language for beginners or not.
And are there any other kinds of bad habits that you feel that Python invites users to develop when they're learning, or any other pitfalls that you see students falling into on a somewhat frequent basis as they're beginning to start programming with Python?
At the moment, nothing else comes to my mind. At least not anything which stems from the language. In fact, I have been planning to experiment with this MyPy project, which allows Python to be used kind of static way. So we'll see whether I can make some exercises for students where they are forced to annotate their variables. So with this support, maybe it's possible to get rid of even this problem. But I don't see any other obstacles caused by the Python language when we are regarding learning to program.
And as I was reading through the documentation, I noticed the fact that Thonny has a plugin architecture and that there's currently an extension that was written for interacting with the BBC microbit, which is a hardware module that was introduced in classrooms in the United Kingdom for introducing students to concepts of programming and hardware interfaces. So I'm wondering if there are any other types of extensions that you would like to see built for Thonny, or if you have any thoughts or interaction with the creator of that microbit extension.
Actually, the creator of this extension is a student of mine. So it was his bachelor thesis, part of his bachelor thesis, and I was his supervisor. So have been quite closely connected to this project. The plugin system is quite flexible. Actually, most of the functionality in Thonny, actually even including the user interface part of the debugger, is implemented as a plugin. So in this sense, I could rephrase your question that what I wish people would build into Thonny, whether by a plugin or by just directly contributing to Thonny's code. Yeah, I have some plans for extensions myself, but if I'm thinking about extensions I wish Thonny would have, but I don't have time for these myself, then I wish Thonny has a tutorial or exercise system, something like which would work like this. An instructor writes down a tutorial or exercise, for example, also with automatic tests, let's say in restructured text format, uploads it to GitHub, and Thonny is able to download the specification and display it in a separate panel, in a side panel, so that the student can see the exercise definition and his code at the same time, and the system is able to test a user's code against these specifications. This is sometimes something that I have planned to do, but I haven't had time for this. So if somebody else wishes to do this, I would be really happy. Also have thinking that it would be nice if Thonny had a basic or simplified support for version control, so that you could open files from GitHub and save them back to GitHub. I've missed these features in a classroom where the students didn't have their own accounts in the lab computers. So some of them did have USB sticks with them, some of them had forgotten them, so it was quite messy. So it would be really nice if it's possible to save your work into cloud, or let's say into GitHub with Thonny. Also, in the next version of Thonny, I hope to have completed a system for defining visual themes. And when this is ready, I expect people to contribute new themes to Thonny. Yeah, but mostly I wish that people or I expect that people are extending Thonny in ways that I don't anticipate at the moment, implementing features that I haven't thought of.
And so for anybody who does want to experiment with Thonny or contribute back to it, I'll make sure to add the link to the project repository in the show notes. Are there any other topics that we didn't discuss yet that you think we should cover, whether in the context of beginning programmers or introduction to the Python language or the Thonny project in particular?
I think I have spoken about all the most important topics for me. Yeah, about the future plans, and also it relates maybe to the previous question about extending Thonny. There's one at the moment. Thonny will help people to learn the semantics of their program or semantics of the program constructs, but total beginners in first weeks, their most urgent or most frustrating problems are syntax errors, and at the moment Thonny doesn't offer any support for this. So I plan to add some support myself. For example, if while statement is missing a colon, then Thonny could tell the user that you are missing a colon here, not that you are having a syntax error here. But I think these kinds of support is something that can come from many contributors. Like there might be different problems that different instructors perceive, and it would be really good if we could collaborate and get the best support for programming errors also into Thonny.
Yeah, I can definitely agree that cryptic error messages can be rather off-putting, especially as you're first getting started, and linting can occasionally help with that, where you can see before you try to run the program that the syntax isn't correct, or that the structure isn't sort of meeting the general community best practices, but oftentimes even those messages aren't structured in a way that are easy to understand. And so I know that a lot of other language communities, particularly things like Elm and Elixir, have put in a lot of effort to make sure that their compiler messages are very descriptive and helpful and provide references to additional documentation that will help people with understanding where the source of their error happens. So I think that having that similar functionality within Thonny or even any Python linter would be very valuable to beginning programmers.
For example, in recent weeks I have met several students who were pulling their hair because they were writing a program with a Python turtle, and they named their program turtle.py, and they were wondering why their program doesn't work. So it's quite easy to support, to give a proper and helpful error message in these cases.
Well, for anybody who wants to follow the work that you're up to or get in touch about the work you're doing, either in Thonny or in your classroom, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us on into the picks. And this week, I know that I've mentioned a few times in past episodes, just briefly, that I have another podcast, but I'm going to call it out specifically that I have been, the past couple of months, releasing weekly the Data Engineering Podcast, which is focused on the challenges and technologies around modern data management and data engineering practices. So for anybody who is working in that space or curious about any of the trends there, I definitely would appreciate you giving that a listen. And then my other pick this week is a movie that I watched over the weekend with my son called Kubo and the Two Strings. And it was just a very well done movie with very interesting animation style and a really well done story. So I highly recommend that. And so with that, I'll pass it to you. Do you have any picks for us this week?
Yeah, I was thinking of two items. So first is MicroPython. I don't know how popular or how well known it is in the Python community, but you were already mentioned this BBC microbit, which is able to run a really nice version of Python called MicroPython, which invites Python programmers to the field of electronics or robotics. And myself also am quite fascinated about this field lately. I'm not expert in this field, but I find it very fun to play around with small microcontrollers supporting MicroPython. So I invite Python programmers to look up MicroPython and maybe buy a $10 board to play with. Okay, and another pick. I'm reading a book about children. It's called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and How to Listen So Kids Will Talk. And if there is a parent who hasn't read it yet, then I definitely recommend it. It really gives it might give you a different view on the problems of your kids or on your relationship with your kids.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to talk to me about your work with Thonny and with teaching beginning programmers. I definitely appreciate that, and I'm planning on using Thonny to teach my own children how to program, so thank you for your work on that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.